December 2020 represents the anniversary of one of the most significant dates in Midleton and East Cork's recent history, the 100th anniversary of the Main Street Ambush. This action led to the first official reprisal of the War of Independence, and was the precursor for the disastrous events in Clonmult in February 1921, which witnessed the greatest loss of life suffered by the IRA in a single action during the war. The global pandemic has meant that plans developed by the Midleton and Ballinhassig Historical Society and the Landscapes of Revolution Archaeology project to mark this 100th anniversary could not take place. But with the support of Cork County Council, we hope that 2021 will see the unveiling of an interpretive panel in Midleton detailing the events of the ambush. In order to mark the centenary now, the Landscapes of Revolution project have decided to prepare this video, which details the dramatic and momentous events that exploded onto the town's main street 100 years ago this week. During the War of Independence, the Irish volunteers in Midleton formed B Company of the 4th Battalion, Cork No. 1 Brigade, Irish Republican Army. Throughout 1920, they had been heavily involved in actions through East Cork, most notably sustained attacks on RIC Barracks, such as those at Carricktool in January 1920 and Clonmult the following May. The Crown's response to these actions intensified as 1920 drew on. Black and Tans and auxiliaries appeared on the streets, and in June the Cameron Highlanders came to Midleton when they moved into the mill buildings on the Mill Road. As the war grew more and more dangerous, violent and deadly, in October a decision was taken to form the 4th Battalion Active Service Unit, otherwise known as the Flying Column. In December, the column had spent most of its time operating between Clonmult, Ahada and Fort Carlisle, hoping to ambush a military patrol from the fort. But despite days of lying in ambush positions, the hoped-for patrol never came, although the column did suffer near disaster when the Camerons raided a safe house they were occupying in Clonmult. Fortunately, the men managed to shoot their way out, and by Christmas Eve they decided to move on. The 4th Battalion column went towards Midleton, because they decided that there was where they were going to attack. The column's commanding officer, Dermot Hurley, known to his men as the Gaffer, decided to strike the RIC when out on patrol. Each evening an RIC black and tan column of around 12 or 13 men left their heavily fortified barracks, which is today the town's Garda station, and moved out through the defences that protected them to march through the town. Walking in pairs on both sides of the road, their patrol route took them the length of the main street and over the bridge at its southern end, before returning via the same route. Seeing this opportunity, Hurley assembled a mixed force of 16 men, some of them from the Flying Column, some of them from the local Midleton Company, and went to strike this patrol. On the evening of the 28th of December, Hurley and his men assembled in a sawmill on Charles Street, now Connolly Street, and waited for the patrol to set out. First, he ordered 2 of his men, Paddy Whelan and Jack Ahern, to go forward and keep an eye out for the patrol so he could be alerted as to when they were passing. One of those men, Paddy, takes up the story. We arranged that I would take up position at the corner of Charles Street, which is situated about midway in the main street and at right angles to it. Jack posted himself further down the main street, in the vicinity of the Midleton Arms Hotel. We were armed with .45 Webley revolvers and wore trench coats and capes. I was only about 5 minutes at my post when I saw the patrol of black and tans marching slowly towards me. They moved in pairs, about 6 paces apart on both sides of the street. All were armed with rifles and revolvers, with the rifles slung on their shoulders. In the last pair on my side was a Constable Gordon, with whom I was well acquainted before I joined the column. When passing, he noticed me, and evidently surprised at seeing me, shouted, "Hello, Paddy!" I said, "Hello, Gordy," which was my usual way of addressing him. For a moment, I thought he would leave the ranks and come over to me, but fortunately he carried on with the patrol. I'm sure my heart missed a beat or two. Gordon knew me well. He had not seen me for the previous few months, and now he was looking at me wearing a trench coat and cap, items of apparel which I had never previously worn in his presence. I remember wondering if he suspected something was afoot. If he did, he kept his suspicions to himself, as the patrol continued sedately down the street. Once the patrol had passed Paddy by, he and Jack dashed back up Connolly Street to inform Dermot Hurley of the enemy dispositions. It was now approaching 9 p.m. Hurley issued his orders, and the volunteers moved out. 10 of them were to take up positions in doorways between Connolly Street and the Midleton Arms Hotel on the main street, which today is J.J. Coppinger's pub. The other 6 were to do likewise on the other side of the road. There they would wait until the Black and Tans were returning, when they would step out from the doorways and begin firing at close range. That was the plan, but in order to get into position, the volunteers had to follow very closely behind the Black and Tans, a highly risky strategy. One of the volunteers, Dan Cashman, described just how they did it. We got into the doorway of Paul McCarthy's at the lower end of the town, pretending to be inebriated. We sang our way up the town, gradually getting nearer our objective. By pretending to be drunk, Cashman and some of the other volunteers hoped not to raise the Black and Tan suspicions. Eventually, everyone was in position, and before long the Black and Tans had turned and begun to move back up the main street. In the doorway of the Midleton Arms Hotel, Dermot Hurley waited for them to pass his position. At Connolly Street, Jack Ahern waited for them to approach. When the patrol was in between them, the volunteers stepped into the street and opened fire at point-blank range, levelling revolvers and rifles at the enemy. Soon all hell had broken loose. Dan Cashman takes up the story once again. We were within 2 yards of 2 Tans, and we immediately opened fire, getting both of them. Turning quickly, Jack Ahern saw the next 2 Tans close behind. He opened fire on them, and one fell. He followed up the other who had run away and fired at him. Meanwhile, shooting broke out up and down the street, and I saw a Tan at Church Lane corner firing towards the main street. As he ran, I fired on him, but I was hit in the chest by a bullet and providentially saved by a cigarette case which I carried in my breast pocket. Another volunteer, Michael Carney, recalled the action as a general free-for-all. In some cases, our lads engaged in hand-to-hand struggles with the enemy. One of his comrades, Joseph Ahern, agreed. He remembered that immediately volunteers and RIC were involved in what in some cases developed into a hand-to-hand affair, in which volunteer Dennehy had a very narrow escape. He was fired on at point-blank range by a Black and Tan. Fortunately, the Tan missed. Dennehy pulled the trigger of his gun, but as he afterwards discovered, there were 2 dud cartridges in it. The Tan had also emptied his gun, and as there was no time for reloading, they closed with each other, endeavouring to use the butts of their revolvers. Jack Ahern noticed his plight and came to his assistance, and soon put the Tan out of action. Yet another volunteer, Michael Desmond, was so close to one of the Black and Tan's guns when it fired that the muzzle flash singed his cheek. In the confusion and terror, and desperate to get away, some of the Black and Tans broke and ran. One dashed through a local shop and out the back door. Others tried to escape via a laneway. When it was over, volunteer John Kelleher recalled that dead and dying Tans lay here and there all over the street. It had lasted, in all, about 15 minutes. The local priest, Father Dennehy, came out to give attention to the wounded and dying, while Cumann na mBan member Agnes Carroll, who lived on Main Street, gave aid to the volunteers. Jim McCarthy had been shot in the hand, but miraculously, otherwise, the IRA volunteers had escaped unscathed. The action over, they began to collect the weapons dropped by the patrol. While this was ongoing, Paddy Whelan found himself only a few yards from one of the wounded Black and Tans lying in the road. I knelt down beside the Tan and spoke to him. He told me his name, which I have now forgotten, and said he was from Liverpool. He said he would resign if he recovered from his wounds. He then offered me his wallet. I took it from his hand and put it back in the breast pocket of his tunic and told him I was doing so. The poor fellow lost a lot of blood, and I expect he was one of those who eventually died of wounds. At least 8 members of the RIC Black and Tan Patrol seem to have been hit during the Midleton Main Street Ambush. Sergeant Maloney and Constables Maher, Wall, Sampson and Partridge recovered. 3 others did not. They were 61-year-old Martin Mullen from Roscommon, a special constable who had first joined the RIC in 1882. 21-year-old Ernest Dray from Kent, who had enlisted in the East Kent Yeomanry aged 15 in 1914 and served in Palestine during the First World War. And 23-year-old Arthur Thorpe, another ex-soldier, who was from Middlesex. As Dermot Hurley and his men withdrew from the battlefield area, locals began to emerge. Some had been sheltering in the cinema while the firing was underway. Meanwhile, word was spreading among the British of the attack, and a relief force sent towards Midleton was also fired upon. Incensed at the action, they determined to take their revenge. As a result of the Midleton ambush, the local British commander, Brigadier-General Higginson, ordered the first official reprisal of the War of Independence. Having delivered their warnings, the military moved into the town and destroyed a number of buildings on the main street, as well as targeting suspected IRA safehouses in the surrounding countryside. They were followed by the Pathé newsreel teams, who created the earliest known film footage of Midleton. A link to that footage can be found beneath this video. Midleton had not seen its last deaths during the War of Independence. Indeed, the IRA struck here again in May 1921, but by then many of those who had participated in the December attack were not alive to see it. After the Main Street ambush, the column had moved north to a small farmhouse in Clonmult, where on the 20th of February 1921 they were surrounded by British forces. In the action that followed, 12 volunteers died, some shot down in cold blood after their surrender. 2 more who were captured were later executed. Their names were Richard Hegarty, Jeremiah Ahern, Christopher O'Sullivan, Joseph Morrissey, Michael Hallahan, Patrick O'Sullivan, James Glavin, John Joe Joyce, James Ahern, Michael Desmond, Donald Dennehy, Liam Ahern, David Desmond and Maurice Moore. Dermot Hurley, who had led the Midleton attack, had been away from the column when Clonmult occurred. But unfortunately, he did not survive the war either. In May 1921, he was shot and killed by a Black and Tan patrol while travelling between Midleton and Carrigtwohill. The Midleton Main Street Ambush of December 1920 was one of the most consequential actions during the War of Independence in East Cork. While the story of the 4th Battalion is rightly recalled on Midleton's memorial and at the gravesides of the fallen, the story of the dramatic events in the heart of the town in December 1920 deserved to be much better known, particularly as so much of this important battlefield landscape still exists around us. The 100th anniversary of this momentous and consequential event provide us with a perfect opportunity to do so.